Each melody just fell away in its own time, in its own way, and somehow managed to retain the very core of what made it special. And then the fact that I had managed to record the life and death of these melodies, to me, was an incredibly profound thing.
Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glamberger channel. It's of course a show where we take, weird, peculiar albums and just, discuss them, have a chat about them. we kind of look at all sorts of different things, but I feel like most of it's, returning to the world of ambient and drone stuff, and that'll be no different in today's episode. Today's episode, we're going to be diving into what I feel is one of the most ambitious and important experimental albums that's ever been conceived, in my opinion. It's an album that, for the right reasons, has been heralded as a masterpiece of ambient composition, and of course is steeped in this very tragic story of sheer coincidence and stuff, and in itself as well is an incredibly moving and cathartic album experience. This is of course a video on William Basinski's magnificent opus, the Disintegration Loops, discs 1 through 4. So, before we begin, let's ask ourselves, who is William Basinski? Well, Basinski is an American queer-identifying avant-garde composer based in Los Angeles, California, originally born in Houston, Texas. Basinski was raised in a Catholic family and became classically trained as a clarinetist before studying jazz saxophone and composition. And it was in the late 70s that Basinski became inspired by minimalist composers like Brian Eno and Steve Reich, and at the time began developing his own vocabulary using tape loops and old reel-to-reel tape decks, creating very somber and melancholy loops. And this would form the basis of a very fascinating and vast career in minimalist ambient composition that, saw a plethora of solo compositions and many collaborations with notable composers, including a favourite here at Weird Music, the one and only Richard Chartier. So as mentioned, we're diving into the phenomenal The Disintegration Loops, a project that originally began in 2001 that saw Basinski exploring process music. And so there is no doubt in my mind that many of you will know the story of the specific process for this album. But for those who don't, if there's any of you out there, I will do a quick run through. Just nice and brief though. So back in 1980, Basinski was experimenting in reel-to-reel tape decks, recording various melancholy loops. Fast forward to 2001, and Basinski then sets about transferring the analog recordings to digital formats. It was during this process though that Basinski discovered that the tapes had deteriorated, and as it passed through the tape head, the ferrite detached from the plastic backing, essentially destroying the tape itself. And by allowing the loops to play for extended periods of time, the tape itself began to deteriorate further and further, with there being more and more gaps and cracks in the music itself, creating a process that literally changed the loops as they continued to play. And then by further treating the sounds with spatializing reverb effects, Basinski ended up with an incredibly long-form ambient compositions that created historical artifacts of the process itself as it had occurred at the time. And so, fascinating process I feel, but there's another element to the story as well that I'm sure no doubt so many of you know, but I'll just go into it briefly. So, the entire process by Basinski, sheer coincidence, coincided with the September 11, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center in New York. The project itself was finished on the morning of September 11, as Basinski sat on the roof of his apartment building in Brooklyn with friends as the World Trade Center collapsed. And Basinski then went on to film the fallout during the last hour of daylight from that very rooftop. And it's stills from this very video that are used as the covers for the 4 discs used for the Disintegration Loops. And as a result of this though, by sheer coincidence, the Disintegration Loops have become attached to this really horrific event in American history, with Basinski himself saying that the event gave new meaning to the musical pieces created by catastrophic decay in my studio a few weeks before. And it's interesting, like, I'll just mention it here briefly, that this is a thing that we've discussed in a bunch of episodes on Weird Music, about how context and understanding create an understanding of an artistic piece, and how such a catastrophic event of American history ended up, cementing itself within the very understanding of, these musical pieces that Basinski had created, and it's all very peculiar and weird though. It adds so much weight and impact to what is already in itself a very heavy and emotional album experience, And so with that, you essentially have the basic story, but as I like to do in Weird Music, I like to dive into the music itself. So this isn't going to be just about the Disintegration Loops, but it's going to be about the whole thing, the entire package. So we're going to start right at the beginning. The Disintegration Loops 1. So, part 1 opens up with DLP 1.1, the first composition in this series that runs at just over an hour in length. And this track, it's probably the most well-known out of all the Disintegration Loops, I feel. I would argue so that this is, it's the first one, of course. This is the easy entry point into the series. And this track, though, it completely envelopes and folds around you in this with this really peculiar melancholy loop that stretches out for such an incredibly long runtime. And, listening to this, it's such an incredibly impactful and emotionally devastating experience to listen to, I'd argue. It's one that really establishes the emotional resonance of the project itself, as well as the key concepts and ideas behind the whole thing, of course. And as well, like the incredibly granular drone, it just loops on forever and forever. And the more it progresses, of course, the more we start to hear the process of it all degrading and dissolving away into its own level of obscurity. And I don't know about you, but I find that whole experience of listening to this music that is just slowly crumbling away to be incredibly emotional. The more it progresses, the more it just crumbles and crumbles. We get less and less of this loop until by the very end, you can still hear it trying to play. We just have the faintest fragments of it. It's still struggling to occur as it plays along, basically. And across its entire hour long length time as well, we as listeners have had so much time to get used to this melancholy loop that starts off the whole experience. And the ending of it all, it just feels so sad and emotional, and it's as though we've watched the decay and death of something in real time. And by this final minute, so you barely have any musical motifs left, as the loop itself, instead you just get these blasts of drones that are struggling to even be heard anymore, as it just fades away into this really obscure silence. And it's a truly brilliant way to open up this whole entire album experience. It's such a long, meditative, ambient drone that just collapses away across its incredibly long runtime. And the loop itself, like the actual musical motifs of that loop itself, it's one that feels arguably simplistic in its own right, but it's so effective at expressing this incredibly melancholy emotion that just leaves you it just leaves you sitting there slowly absorbing the resonance of everything that has just been experienced, if that makes sense. There's truly little like it. An amazing thing. But there's a little bit more to the Disintegration Loops Disc 1. As DLP 1.1 fades away, we get a fade in of the album's second track, DLP 2.1, a short 10-minute drone that closes off the first disc. And so this loop, I feel like this is actually one of my favorites. The musical motif itself, it's one that, as it fades in, you get this blast of ambience that is desperately trying to ascend out of the smoke and ashes of everything. And the effect of the decay itself, I would say it's arguably less prominent than what we heard on DLP 1.1, but it is of course still there, giving everything and every iteration of the loop itself more of a struggle to rise up basically out of everything that's slowly decaying. And what I love about this one is how in the background you've got this really emotional and melancholy backing drone that seems to be attempting to hold up this now decaying loop, doing what it can to support this slowly destroying musical experience. It's a beautiful composition and it perfectly closes off the first disc of this entire album. So from here, we move on to the Disintegration Loops 2, featuring two compositions of DLP 2.2 and DLP 3. So this first disc, the first track, it instantly reprises the previous 10-minute drone from disc 1, throwing us back into that beautifully dark, melancholy soundscape that by what point had already been decaying, basically. This 30-minute reprise of which, it allows us to experience, much more of that crumbling decay again. Again, like this will come up a lot though, but as the track progresses, the loop itself is just constantly struggling to hold itself up and, exist, if that makes sense, And what began as a very melancholy experience on the first disc has now developed into something so much more catastrophic, I would argue. It's become incredibly emotionally devastating as it all just crumbles and fades. And what's truly beautiful though is how the backing ambient drone that was established on DLP 2.1, it continues to push forward throughout the entire 30-minute runtime of DLP 2.2, and it helps to push that recording along as we experience that loop just crumbling until it's barely playing anymore. And then by the end of it, it's as though there's no loop left there, only the faintest glimmers of it struggling to occur and even be heard. And the rest of it just sounds so distorted, broken, and it's like it no longer exists as a tangible thing anymore. I find myself floored by this one. It's beautiful in its really weird, tragic way, and it's so emotionally devastating and impactful. And so from there, Disc 2 moves on to DLP 3, the nearly 42-minute composition that further continues this dark, melancholy journey of decay and destruction. And so, I'll say here, across every disc of the Disintegration Loops, I would say that this is perhaps one of my top favourites of all of them. Once again, the actual loop itself, musically, it feels actually somewhat simplistic, almost minimalist, I would say. It's a small ambient drone that is climbing up from out of itself, whilst in the background. I notice you have actually this very peculiar micro-sound percussive beat that's pushing it along, if that makes sense. And I don't know why though, but I find there to be something incredibly emotionally impactful about this one. Just the tones of it, how it's progressing, how it's just so full of melancholy and despair. It really gets to me every single time I hear this one. And this one, it feels like the slowest parade, just marching at this very glacial pace towards the vast empty space that is out there. And as it progresses onward and onward, once again you're hearing it all deteriorate as the notes themselves just become hollow and empty. There's nothing, no longer there, and no longer able to proceed with this melancholy procession, even though it's still being pushed forward, if that makes sense. And then by the end of it all, there's barely any music left, holding it all together, as though all you've got is just this bare, empty skeleton of what once was. This one is truly a phenomenal experience, and it genuinely floors me every single time I hear it, and I don't know why, just easily my favourite out of all of them. I love all of the loops that are on this whole experience, but this one, I don't know why, it really stands out to me as my favourite. It's a truly beautiful experience. And so then we move on to the Disintegration Loops 3, the next installment in the series that offers us DLP4 and DLP5. And so on this one, a further pushing of what's been brilliantly established on the first two discs, of course, though there's actually no reprises of any loops. And in fact, looking at it now, the Disintegration Loops 3 is the only one in the series of the 4 albums to feature its own unique music compared to the other discs, you know. Disc 2 reprises the second track from Disc 1, and Disc 4 reprises the first track of Disc 1, and Disc 3 doesn't reprise any tracks though. And yeah, a little interesting note I realised when you know, writing all this stuff, I thought it was worth mentioning. But in any case though, you know, Disc 3, we opened up with DLP4, and this is a 20-minute loop that comes together as a very dark, foreboding, melancholy experience, of course. Like, no doubt, you know, dark, foreboding and melancholy, like, it's to be expected with Basinski's music, but it is a perfectly apt descriptor for what we experience here. Musically, it ties in really well though to the other loops we have heard so far. It's a loop that is attempting to climb up and ascend the notes into something arguably more hopeful, but instead it's just getting pulled back down into the, you know, by the very act of disintegration itself. And no matter how hard the music tries, it all just gets pulled back down below the surface where, you know, you can't be heard anymore, you know, right under the surface of it all. And, you know, DLP4 is very interesting as, comparatively to most of the other loops, it's somewhat short, I would say, and yet it arguably has some of the most severe instances of degradation in the loops itself, you know. As it progresses, you get these really long passages of distorted silence where the magnetic tape simply is no longer there to be played, and instead you only have the briefest glimmers of what was originally there in the loop, you know, desperately trying to pull itself back up out of it all. And by the end, though, of this one, it feels so weird and peculiar as it's such a ghostly artifact of what once was. And I find the despair that comes across on this one to be a really powerful thing. It expresses such an incredible emptiness that is prevalent in the music itself, as though there's simply just nothing left anymore by this point. Truly surreal, I would say, truly surreal. And so then we move on to DLP5, the closer for part 3 of the Disintegration Loops. And so this loop, another interesting one. I mean, no doubt they're all very interesting, but this one's, the actual vibe to it is very peculiar, and when it first starts off though, it doesn't take very long for the loop to establish itself, and when it does, we're sort of given something that's arguably gentle and, you know, maybe even whimsical and charming, if that makes sense, you know. The tones in how they express themselves feel like one of the lightest moments across the entire experience. And as such, DLP5 comes across as a somewhat gentle moment of respite for the entire album experience itself. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's of course this peculiar melancholy quality to it all, but there's something really satisfying about this one though. It's melancholy that doesn't make me feel as depressed and low as you would think it would do, if that makes sense. If anything, it's one of the more enigmatic loops in terms of how it's coming across. Of course, it might just be me though, to be fair. Like, to be fair with this one, the degradation of the loop does start to occur gradually at first, and then more and more intensely as the track pushes along, you know. And what feels, you know, sort of charming and oddly comforting in a weird way, it starts to express that empty and despairing quality that we've become accustomed to by this point. You know, the destruction of the physical magnetic tape itself starts to leave those big gaps in the loop, as we've mentioned, and then you get that final crawl in the last 10 minutes where the whole track is barely pulling itself together anymore, and I find it so interesting how it starts off as sort of comforting and then even just destroys itself into this, very empty, melancholy thing. It's interesting though how effortlessly these tracks all express such clear and concise emotions through the happenstance of the process itself. It's like, it's phenomenal and it's emotional and weirdly gut-wrenching as well. Like perhaps because we have listeners who have sat down and experienced these loops gradually slowing and decaying, starting as fully formed compositions and turning into these skeletal remnants of what they originally had been. There's something so emotional and cathartic about that process itself. It expresses such a pristine beauty in such a very weird way, if that makes sense. And so from there, we move on to the final disc to close off everything. After the entire beautiful melancholy ordeal, we have one last disc to finalize this entire project. And disc 4 opens up with DLP 6, a 40-minute track whose loop feels both melancholy yet uplifting in some respects. Now of course, as with all the loops, we're given that time to get comfortable and understand how this loop sounds and the very emotions it expresses as it occurs. And what I find interesting about this one though is that there's a level of intensity that seems to be slowly building with it. And as it progresses of course, and even as it starts to fade away into its the expected obscurity, it's very interesting that it still builds up to that point. And it's interesting how this loop seems to morph and shift into something else entirely by the end, like despite it being the exact same loop that we've heard in the opening section of this very track, if that makes sense. Out of all the loops, the musical elements incorporated on the original loop feels a little bit more experimental than the rest of the loops, if that makes sense. But of course, it's still all tying into this wonderful, overall concept that the album is portraying. However, the Disintegration Loops doesn't stop there with DLP 6. It instead closes out with two reprisals of the first loop, with both DLP 1.2 and DLP 1.3. And I have to say, this is a very fascinating way to end off the entire album experience, as you're given a bookend that harkens back to the very opening of this entire album experience. And, as DLP 1.2 further pushes that disintegration, with it all sounding a bit murkier and darker than it did on DLP 1.1. But then when you get to DLP 1.3, the whole thing just sounds so emotional, and it's like the music can barely breathe anymore by this point. As though it physically falls apart. It's leaving behind the most damaged and strangled sounding musical motifs of itself. And I'm not sure why I find this particular version of DLP1 to be the most heaviest and emotional sounding, but I just do for some reason. There's something about it that makes me feel that way. The whole thing just struggles to move, and it really emotionally resonates in such a powerful way, especially when you sit down and you listen to every single disc in order. Now, no doubt it's an incredibly difficult ordeal to navigate through, but in doing so, you get this fascinating story that bookends itself with DLP1. It's truly phenomenal stuff. And so, with that, we have essentially covered the entirety of the Disintegration Loops 1 to 4 by William Basinski. And now, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is, without a doubt in my mind, one of the most important and powerful experimental albums ever conceived, in my opinion. It's a project that has resonated so powerfully with not just myself, but with so many people around the world. And the impact of this project, it's truly astounding though, with there being so many fascinating dives into the album by so many people out there. There's countless essays, video essays out there as well if you want to discover more. Like, people have really dug deep into this album, It's certainly gained its own level of infamy for, in some regards, but like so many albums of a deep melancholic nature, it's definitely for the right reasons. And as it is as well, whenever I sit down to listen to Disintegration Loops, it's whichever disc, truth be told, I always find myself completely lost within the slow-moving drones, the music itself just slowly filling me with this powerful sense of melancholy that is it's a thing that's very prevalent in Basinski's music, of course, don't get me wrong. The man just has this real brilliant way of expressing powerful emotions in his music. And the Disintegration Loops is one that comes across so effectively with each and every track. And so with that, I think we'll be coming to the end of today's episode of Weird Music. Yeah, this is an interesting one, going through all 4 discs, but I like to talk about the music and how the music makes me feel, if that makes sense. And yeah, there was a lot I want to discuss as well, like when chatting about Disintegration Loops, especially diving into it song by song, but regardless, I'm glad to have taken the time to talk about this truly fascinating project. It is certainly one that when I first heard it, it opened up my eyes to experimental music and, really it was fascinating to learn about. And as well, seeing the reception this album has garnered on the internet, since it first started to this very day, there's something incredibly delightful about it, I'm glad this album has actually touched the hearts of so many people out there. And before we sign off though, I would like to mention, of course, the fantastic body of work out there by William Basinski. If you've actually enjoyed the Disintegration Loops, but never heard anything else of his, check out his other albums, because there's some truly phenomenal pieces of work in there. 2 particular favourites of mine being A Shadow in Time and The Garden of Brokenness. The latter being one of the really beautifully sad album. It's phenomenal stuff. We might talk about it in a future episode. But for now, I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music. I wish you all the best. Take care and bye bye for now. Bye bye.